Thank you, Max, for the introduction, and also thank you for the invitation to speak in Procurement Asia today. Hello, everyone. This is Wei Siong Tan from GTR Growth. Today, I'll be speaking about procurement tactics and strategies during pandemic, trade disputes, rising geopolitical factors, and increasing natural disasters. Those that have been in supply chain long enough knows that managing supply chain is a challenge to begin with under normal circumstances. Now combine that with disruption, you actually bring it to a whole new level. But before we begin, please remember to ask questions in the comment section below. And for those that stays until the end of the discussion, I'll be sharing slides from today's presentation and also some additional slides which I wouldn't have time to cover today. A little bit about GTR Growth. GTR Growth is a consulting company where we help our clients reach their full potential through design, product development, operation, supply chain and logistic, and also finance. As our world economy becomes more integrated and dependent on each other, you will see more and more disruptions in supply chain. And this slide here summarizes some major events over the last 10 years. In 2010, we had the Iceland volcano eruption, where the ashes from the eruption had affected the airspace that were bringing high value and perishable goods. In 2010, we had the Thailand flooding where over 2/3 of Thailand were affected by this. And as a result of it, production for electronics, automotive, and commercial goods were all affected. In 2011, we had the Japan tsunami. And as a result of that, again, production for high-end value electronics, automotive, and specialty equipment were all affected. In 2014, United States had one of the most severe winter weather, and it had actually had some significant delays in its supply chain. 2015, the Turkish armed force had gunned down a Russian jet, and as a result of that, the Russian government had stopped the trucks and containers coming from Turkey at its border. In 2016, we have Brexit that have interrupted the supply chain between United Kingdom and EU. And this is something that will continue to unravel itself. And it is not just going to have an impact on duty, but also on warehousing, on planning, to custom clearance time. In 2019, we had the trade war between the world's two largest economies, United States and China. And as a result of that, we saw implications, whether it is duty, foreign exchange rate, or companies scrambling to move their production to different locations to minimize the risk or the impact of the trade war. And in 2020, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. As countries try to contain the spread of the virus, it has had an impact on supply chain and at the same time on the overall demand. The events that I've just covered in the previous slide are unique by itself. But when you were to break it down in a very simplistic manner, you realize that there's a common theme with regards to its implication on supply chain. So lead time, cost, foreign exchange, quality, allocation, and uncertainty are common theme with regards to its implication on supply chain. So lead time. Standard lead time are no longer standard during time of crisis. Also expect to see an increase in costs, and it's not just going to be about the unit cost. You need to consider the total landed cost, including any expedited freight or expedited costs. Foreign exchange. is another important factor. Keep two things in mind when you look at foreign exchange rate. First of all, always understand your base currency for your revenue. Second bit to this is that understand that there is a lot that goes into foreign exchange and it's not that straightforward. So in 2011, when we had the Japan earthquake and tsunami, a lot of people had anticipated that the Japanese yen would depreciate, but in reality, it went the other way. Quality, as suppliers scramble to meet your demand requirement, there's a risk or tendency for quality issues. So keep that in mind, make sure that there's process and controls in place. Allocation, when you have shortages, you have allocation. And it's not just about allocation of parts, it's allocation of capacity, time, and resource too. Uncertainty is also another important factor. Expect changes between what was planned and what was executed, because during time of crisis, there's lack of information and constant changes. So it is really a test of your decision making and adaptation to changes during time of crisis. Before I go into the different procurement tactics that you can adopt, I will briefly discuss the different phases that you go through during disruptions. Do understand that this is a general classification, and I've used the law of supply and demand to explain this. So in general, there are four phases. The first phase is when everything is at equilibrium. So business as usual, no major issues from a supply and demand point of view, and pricing is relatively stable. In phase two, you have a contraction with regards to supply. So you have material shortages, allocation, price increase, and overbooking. In phase three, you have a contraction in demand. During this phase, usually central government would use stimulus to stimulate the economy and to build up consumer confidence. And during this stage or during this phase, you will have excess inventory, excess capacity, and everyone is in survival mode. So companies will cut their spending on capital expenditure. They will cut inventory, capacity, and even reduce the size of their organization at times. One important point that I would like to make here is that phase two and phase three are interchangeable, and the magnitude differs from case to case. So for instance, in 2008, you had the global financial crisis, and there was a contraction in demand in phase two. And as a result of that, companies went into survival mode. So they cut capacity, they stopped investing in new machines. And as a result of that, in phase three, you had a supply contraction. Now compare that to CD19, when in phase two, we had a contraction in supply when the outbreak first started in China. But this quickly turned into a global pandemic, and as a result of that, there is a contraction in demand in phase three. And with regards to CV19 specifically, this is where we are right now. So in phase four, this is when you have demand expansion. I know right now, as we are all living through this global pandemic, it doesn't seem like this day will ever come. But believe me, this day will come, and when it comes, the economy will recover, the demand will increase, and you will have common issues or common problems like you had in the past, whether it's material shortage, allocation, price increase, and overbooking. In this slide here, I will be discussing some tactics that you can use to manage disruption in your supply chain. In phase one, when you have business as usual, you should actually use this time to build the foundation to better manage your supply chain during crisis. And I'll be discussing more of this in the next slide when I talk about the strategy side of this. In phase two, when you have supply contraction, one of the first things that you need to do is identify risks within your supply chain, whether it's bottleneck, risky suppliers, or risky components. When you have this information, you can then prioritize with regards to how you would secure your components, whether it is through spot buy or building buffer. Now, for those that have multiple global sites, one of the things that you need to do is to consolidate all the demand and requirement across all the sites and do it from a central point of view. You should also share inventories within the sites and also expedite any new supplier or component qualification, because this will give you flexibility, which is very much needed at time of crisis. You should also increase your planning frequency to have a better control of the situation. In the next phase, that is when you have demand contraction. And a few tactics that you can adopt here is to, first of all, make sure that you have close communication with your customers to understand their overall demand and any end-of-life risks. You should cancel or reschedule any components that you don't need at the moment, because you will be faced with pressure from an inventory turn and cash flow point of view. Monitor your inventory, open orders, and liabilities closely, and also monitor and keep an eye out for suppliers that may be distressed when demand contracts. And during this stage, you should use this time to prepare for the next stage when there is expansion from a demand point of view. In phase four, that is when you have demand expansion. One of the first few things that you can do is to work closely with your 3PL to discuss flexibility or different routes that you can use. You should also keep an eye out for a bullwhip effect and manage this demand closely. And at the same time, you can use a couple of the things that we have discussed in phase two when you have supply contraction to manage this. In this slide here, I will be discussing some procurement strategies that you can use to better manage your supply chain during disruptions. Now, keep in mind that strategies describes the final destination and how you get there. As we go through these different strategies, keep two things in mind. What is the result that you hope to achieve and the purpose behind it? Let's get started. Identifying risk. What is the result that you hope to achieve here? You want to get a clear understanding of the risk within your value chain. Why is this important? Only by understanding the risk can you only take actions to resolve it. So getting basic information like sole source, long lead time, customer consign, and risky location is very important. Real-time data. What is the result that you hope to achieve here? You want to get real-time information regarding your value chain. Why is this important? Only by having real-time information can you make better decisions. Now, a lot of people have this concept that you need a fully integrated massive data in order for this to work. But you can always start small. So basic information like open orders, inventory, VMI, and do it by customer and product line would be a very good starting point. Next, process. What is the result that you hope to achieve here? You want to get a clearly defined process. And this applies to both short-term and mid to long-term. Mid to long-term processes are related to anything from supply sourcing, supply qualification, or supply evaluation. Short-term process may be related to PPV, approval process, or spot buying process. Now, why is this important? During time of crisis, you do not have time to spare. So it's important for everyone within the organization to be clear on who, what, when, how, and why. Category management. What is the result that you hope to achieve here? You want to get alignment with your category strategy. Why is this important? Category strategy works on mid to long-term strategies. Now, if you don't get alignment with your category strategy, you will always be firefighting. Next one, supplier partnership. What is the result that you hope to achieve here? You want to have a strong partnership with supplier for two reasons. First of all, you need to tap into their resource to help you better manage risk within your supply base. At the same time, you want to get their support during time of crisis. Now, why is this important? First of all, resources are not unlimited. So it's very important for you to tap into their resource. Second of all, during time of crisis, that extra touch, that extra relationship that you have with suppliers will make a lot of difference. In the next two slides here, I will be doing a CV19 case study to put the different things that we have discussed into context. So in this slide here, it outlines the 4 different phases. In phase 1, it's when we had the initial virus outbreak within China. As a result from that, we saw disruptions within the supply chain, but it was really confined to China. And at that time, demand was still relatively strong. In phase 2, the outbreak had spread to different countries, and we saw further disruption in supply chain in other countries. But this was more or less softened as we saw some demand contraction at that time. In phase 3, which is where we are right now, we have the full lockdown. And in this stage, we have a full demand contraction. And at the same time, we are also seeing some further supply chain contraction here as companies goes into a survival mode here. In phase 4, as I've mentioned, that is when we have an expansion in demand. And I believe specifically for CV19, when that happens, we will see a new landscape within supply chain, whether it is new manufacturing footprint for some countries, more digitization within supply chain, or some new technology that we will adopt as we come out from this and reach a new normal. Another thing that I believe will happen here is that any expansion within the supply chain will lag behind any demand expansion, because companies will want to be very sure that the demand and economy has recovered before further investing in their company. So in this slide here, we will talk about some of the tactics and strategies, again outlined across the different phases. So in phase one, when we had the initial outbreak, we saw actions or tactics such as spot buy, buffer stock, new supplier and component approval. In phase two, when the outbreak further spread within outside of China, some of the initiatives or actions that were taken included increasing your planning frequency and close discussion with customers. In phase three, during the lockdown, the actions were revolve around cancellation of orders, rescheduling, and closely monitoring your supply chain, especially for suppliers that may be in distress. In this stage, I would also recommend that companies continue to qualify alternative components or suppliers to prepare themselves to have flexibility, which is going to be needed as we get into phase four. And at the same time, build the foundation now. A lot of the things that that you need to do when you build the foundation has already been discussed in the procurement strategy slides. And in phase four is when we get into a new normal. At that time, you will be ramping up again, you will be executing, and at the same time, adjusting to a new supply chain landscape. Up to now, we have looked at a couple of things. We have looked at a number of major supply chain disruptions over the last 10 years. We have also looked at the implications of these disruptions on supply chain, and we have looked at the different procurement tactics and strategies that one can adopt to better manage these disruptions. If there's any takeaway that I hope that you got out from today's discussion, it is these three. Takeaway one, as we become more integrated and dependent on each other, you will see more and more supply chain disruptions. Second takeaway, balance the different procurement tactics and strategies that we have discussed to better manage the different crises or supply chain disruptions. And this is going to vary from companies to companies and crisis to crisis. Takeaway three, always tap into your experience, creativity, and intuition when dealing with these different challenges. I'd like to end today's discussion with this quote. It is dark before the dawn, but the dawn never fails. This quote here have helped me tremendously when faced with different challenges. And I hope that everyone will keep this in mind as we are dealing with the pandemic of COVID-19. Finally, a little bit about myself. I'm Wei Siong Tan from GTR Growth. I've over 18 years of experience in operation and supply chain. And for those that have stayed until the end of the discussion, as promised, I will be sharing with you the slides from today's presentation. And you can contact me via email, LinkedIn, or WeChat. Again, I would like to thank Max for the invitation to speak at Procurement Asia, and I would also like to thank everyone for your time today. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this presentation. That was very interesting. I wanted to remind you again that you can ask questions at any time just by posting comments on this page. I see that some of you already asked questions, so go ahead, don't hesitate to ask your own questions. The speakers are here, they can answer them live, but also after the live event. So if you are watching those sessions after the live summit, No worries, speakers will come back. The other thing also I wanted to do is to remind you to join us if you are attending the live event for the virtual networking sessions, which are taking place after the panel discussion at 11:30 Hong Kong. During that virtual networking, you will be able to meet also and interact with the speakers and the delegates at different tables. We have created some kind of a virtual lounge where you guys can meet each other. So that's pretty cool. I really recommend that you come and join us. Last thing is that we have also a group on chain.net. So some of you might have already received an invitation for this. We create a private group discussion on our online community, chain.net, and you then can continue the discussion, continue asking